Have you ever thought that behind the legend of Dracula lies a truth much darker than we could imagine? A truth buried in blood-soaked manuscripts, dark rituals forgotten by time, and secrets no one dares to reveal. Today we won't explore the Count from the movies, but the true face of the man who inspired the myth. The horror that time itself tried to forget. And trust me, what you're about to discover will forever change the way you see the shadow of the vampire. Welcome to the channel where legends come alive, and mysteries reveal their hidden face. If forbidden truths and forgotten stories fascinate you, subscribe now to the channel, because what you're about to hear, you won't find anywhere else. To find the roots of the legend, we must abandon the misty castles and the chests of sacred earth. We must return to the 15th century, to a blood-soaked borderland divided between Christianity and the Ottoman Empire. This is where we meet the man, Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia. He was born in 1431 in the city of Sighisoara, in the very heart of Transylvania, a land of mists and castles, where day and night seem to blur into one. His father, Vlad II, belonged to an ancient knightly order, the Order of the Dragon, a sworn oath of blood and iron, founded in 1408 by Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg, to defend Christendom against the advance of the Ottoman Empire. Their symbol was a dragon biting its own tail, its flames and claws intertwined like an eternal serpent, in Latin Draco. And from that symbol a name was born, Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Dragon. But his heir, the son destined to inherit his shadow, would bear an even more powerful name, Drăculea, the son of the dragon. And yet, within that word, a double meaning was hidden. Because in the language of the people, Drac meant not only dragon, but also devil. And so, without anyone willing it, that name, Drăculea, transformed into a cursed inheritance, son of the devil. It was an omen of what was to come. A damned legacy that would shape not only his life, but the very legend that still echoes through the nights of Transylvania. And Vlad did not disappoint this sinister fame. To consolidate his power and instill terror in his enemies, he adopted a method of punishment so cruel and effective that it would secure him an eternal place in history as Vlad the Impaler. Imagine the scene: thousands of stakes, men, women, children, Ottoman soldiers, German merchants, treacherous nobles, a forest of the dead stretching for kilometers at the gates of the cities. The Romanian historian says that a Turkish ambassador, faced with this spectacle, refused to remove his turban out of respect. Vlad, not to be outdone, nailed it to his head. But the peak of his theatrical cruelty is perhaps contained in a German document from 1463. The Saxon chronicles of Brasov tell of a macabre feast of the impaled. Vlad organized a banquet right beside the forest of decomposing bodies. It is said that when a servant covered his nose from the stench, Vlad had him impaled immediately, but higher than the others, declaring with pitiless irony that he would thus breathe better air. This is not legend, it is chronicle. This is where history divides. For the West and for his enemies, Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, was a psychopathic monster. But for his people, for the Wallachia he defended with inhuman ferocity from the Ottoman invader, he was a hero. A ruthless liberator, perhaps, but the only one capable of standing up to an empire. He was a man of his time, a time of blood and iron. Born in an era where survival was measured in cruelty. But behind this brutality, a frightening logic was hidden. For Vlad, blood was not just filth or terror. It was a symbol. Power, his dominion over life and death. Sacrifice, the price to pay for the strength and salvation of his kingdom. Purification, the cleansing of his enemies through a symbolic bath in their own blood. And it was not just bloodthirsty madness. It was a philosophy of terror. In 1457, in a letter to the King of Hungary that historians today call the Devil's Letter, Vlad justified his massacres by writing that only through terror can the corruption of men be purified, a fanaticism that saw in blood an instrument of purification. The obsession with the symbolism of blood was already there in history, long before it became the lifeblood for a vampire. But how does a bloodthirsty despot from the 1400s transform into the king of the undead? How is this leap made from historical horror to occult legend? The journey has only just begun. That leap from man to myth begins precisely with his own cruelty. But not in Transylvania. It begins in the printing houses of Germany and Russia. After his death, the stories of Vlad the Impaler spread through Europe via a form of entertainment of the era, pamphlets. These sheets were the clickbait of the Renaissance. Horrible stories, vividly illustrated, designed to sell and scandalize. The Germans, with whom Vlad had commercial conflicts, painted the portrait of a sadistic and bloodthirsty monster. The historical reality of a prince defending his realm was lost, and all that remained was the image of the butcher. The black legend of Drăculea was born. And here, history makes a leap of 4 centuries. Onto the stage steps an Irish author named Bram Stoker. A man not of sword and blood, but of pen and ink. Stoker was not a historian. He was a researcher. And while searching for a name for his new, terrifying vampire count, he came across a book in the library of Whitby, and there he saw it. Drăculea, the son of the devil. A name that contained centuries of horror within it. It was a stroke of genius. Stoker understood that no invented name would ever carry the same weight, the same dark resonance. And while searching for a name for his new, terrifying vampire count, he came across a book in the library of Whitby, and there he saw it. Drăculea, the son of the devil. A name that contained centuries of horror within it. It was a stroke of genius. Stoker understood that no invented name would ever carry the same weight, the same dark resonance. And he did more. He took that Prince of Wallachia and transferred him to Transylvania, a remote land on the borders of civilized Europe, already shrouded in legends of werewolves and witches. Stoker never set foot there. But thanks to his imagination and sometimes inaccurate travel accounts, he created the perfect setting for his monster, a Gothic and primitive kingdom where anything could happen. And so, in 1897, Count Dracula is born. No longer just a cruel despot, but a supernatural being, an undead lord of the night, seducer and predator. Stoker had fused the kernel of truth of Vlad Tepes with centuries of dark folklore, giving the world its definitive vampire. But what folklore? What are these ancestral and terrible beliefs upon which Stoker built his creature? Why is the fear of the vampire so universal and ancient? The answer is not found in books, but in the terror of the most remote villages of Europe, a terror that had already existed for millennia. Before Dracula, before Stoker, before even Vlad Tepes. The fear was already among them. Not an elegant count, but a neighbor, a relative, someone you knew and believed dead and buried. This fear had a name. In Romania it was the Strigoi, an undead, a revenant that rose from the grave to suck the life from the living, drinking their blood and tormenting their nights. It was not a noble, it was a peasant. It was not a guest, it was an epidemic. And throughout Slavic and Balkan folklore there existed the vricolakas, being similar to werewolves and vampires. But this was not a passive fear. It was a fear that led to action. Extreme actions. When malaria, tuberculosis, or a simple famine struck a village, and someone suspected a dead person was the cause, they did not hesitate to dig up the body. The signs were clear. A flexible body, rosy skin, blood at the mouth, nails and hair that seemed to still be growing. These were not natural phenomena of decomposition. They were proof that a vampire was among them, and so the final rite to stop the horror. The stake through the heart to nail it to the earth. Decapitation to separate the spirit from the body. Burial face down so that if it tried to dig, it would go deeper and not upward. The severing of the tendons to prevent it from walking. And the variants were endless. In some villages of Serbia, it was believed the vampire could only be destroyed by burning the body and scattering the ashes in a rushing river, because the running water would wash away the curse. In Romania, they used iron, a symbol of the sun and male strength, to keep the shadows at bay. They placed scythes or iron tools upon the grave. These are not Hollywood inventions. They are ancestral rites, documented by ethnographers, practiced in secret in some villages until the 19th century. This fear was so concrete and widespread that it forced the authorities to intervene. The archives return to us the first documented cases of vampirism in European history. In 1725, in Kisilova, Serbia, The case of the peasant Petr Blagojevich was so shocking that the Austrian authorities drafted an official report. The document, which we can still consult today, describes his exhumed body as fresh, with blood dripping from his lips. It is the first time the word vampire appears in an official act. The following year, in 1726, another case shook Europe, that of the soldier Arnold Paule. After his death, an epidemic of presumed vampire attacks struck his village. The official medical report, the Visum et Repertum, describes in macabre detail the exhumations of the living bodies. The case was so influential that the Habsburg Empire was forced to issue the first anti-vampire decrees in history, an incredible official recognition of an epidemic of superstitious fear. Every village had its ritual. Every grave could hide a secret. And the deeper one digs into these superstitions, the more one realizes that the myth of the vampire was not a story, but was rooted in the blood and daily terror of the people. Now the circle closes. Stoker invented nothing. He simply stitched it all together. He took the historical cruelty of Vlad Drăculea and dressed it in the skin of the Strigoi and its macabre rites. He took a hero monster of history and transformed him into the king of all humanity's ancient fears. But is that all? No, because the legend of Dracula hides details that almost no one knows. Bizarre facts you won't find in textbooks, chilling coincidences and secrets that might make you doubt it's all just a legend. But what if all this had been told to us only by his enemies? What if it were just propaganda? The strength of a legend is measured by the solidity of its foundations. And Dracula's foundations are of stone and ink. They are the documents. Let's take the letters of Vlad the Impaler, those he himself signed. In one, dated 1457, addressed to the merchants of Brasov, he threatens, "If anyone among you is found guilty, they will be impaled." This is not the voice of a madman, but of a calculator. It is proof that impalement was not a fit of rage, but a policy of terror, administrative, almost bureaucratic. And then there are the accounts of those who saw him in action. Gabriele Capiolina, an envoy of the Pope, writes in 1460 of having met Vlad. He does not describe him as a monster, but as a man of medium height, with large cold eyes and an aquiline nose. A man whose gaze alone inspired a reverential fear. It is the direct testimony of the frightening charisma he must have possessed. And the accounts of his enemies are even more vivid. A 15th century German document describes Vlad Tepes as a lord who feasted among the bodies of his impaled enemies. And in a letter from 1462, the envoys of Matthias Corvinus report having seen a valley of transfixed men crying out to the wind. Some chroniclers claimed that Vlad had a secret ritual. After every battle, he would wash his hands in the blood of the fallen, believing it granted him strength and protection. The obsession with blood was already there in history, long before it became the lifeblood for a vampire. But the most chilling source remains the Chronicle of Antonio Bonfini, the official historian of King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Bonfini recounts that Vlad once gathered thousands of poor, sick, and beggars under the pretext of offering them a feast. He seated them in a great hall, and then gave the order to set it on fire. Thus, writes Bonfini, no one would be poor in his kingdom any longer. An act of such inhuman and ideological cruelty that it surpasses all imagination. Faced with these papers, the portrait is complete. He is not the sadist of the German pamphlets, nor the romantic hero of some nationalist. He is something more complex and terrible, a man who believed cruelty was a duty, that terror was the only language the world understood. A man for whom blood had to flow, not for pleasure, but for a twisted ideal of order and purity. And yet, despite his fame as a tyrant, for his people he was a savior. Because in those borderlands, evil and good were two faces of the same merciless coin. Vlad became a symbol of absolute power. And when the authorities tried to erase his memory, the people transformed it into legend. Dracula ceased to be a man and became an eternal shadow. But the fear of the vampire he would inspire was not just a countryside legend. It was a fear so real and so profound that it left indelible traces we are still finding today. Because the true proof that the terror of the undead was a serious and terrifyingly widespread phenomenon does not come from books, but from the earth. From archaeological dig. In 2009 in Venice, archaeologists found a 16th century female skull with a brick forced into its mouth, a ritual sign meant to prevent the dead from biting the living. They called it the Vampire of Venice, and it is not an isolated case. In Drăculea, Poland, 6 bodies were found buried with iron scythes placed across their necks. A macabre and ingenious way to automatically decapitate the vampire, should it attempt to rise from the tomb. Even in the Czech Republic and Bulgaria, other graves showed stakes driven through the chest and bound hands, as if the fear of the dead returning had never truly disappeared, but was only buried, waiting to be brought to light. And the testimonies of this fear are everywhere. In a village in Moravia, a grave digger in the 1700s discovered in horror that the same grave kept mysteriously reopening. When they dug it up, they found the body in a different position. The solution was drastic. The corpse was nailed to the ground with an iron plate and covered with sacred stones to prevent its return forever. Even in Italy, in 17th century Friuli, they feared the plague vampires, believed to spread epidemics after death. As a 2010 forensic study published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences confirms, the practice of putting a brick in the mouth of corpses was widespread to prevent them from eating the living and spreading the disease. The Venetian find of 2009 is not an isolated case, but proof of a European obsession. But if the bodies are there, the question arises spontaneously: what were those people really seeing? Modern science has tried to provide answers. In many cases, the vampires were nothing more than victims of natural decomposition, misunderstood by those who found them. Bodies swollen by internal gases appeared resurrected, and fresh blood could leak from their mouths, terrifying those who exhumed them. Even the sinister sound heard when a stake was driven into the chest was not a cry from the dead, but air escaping the lungs. But for those living in poor villages without medical explanations, that was undeniable proof the vampire truly existed. Some scholars hypothesize that real, misunderstood diseases were at the root of the vampire tales. Take porphyria, for example, a rare blood disease that causes a spectral pallor, extreme sensitivity to sunlight, and receding gums that can make the teeth appear longer and sharper. And then there's rabies, an infection that alters behavior, making people aggressive with muscle spasms and a strong aversion to light and strong smells, like that of garlic. But the discoveries do not end here, because the legend of Dracula hides details that almost no one knows. Everyone knows Bran Castle, the fake Dracula's castle, full of tourists and souvenirs. But almost no one knows the real fortress of Vlad Tepes, Poenary Castle. Bran is a postcard. Poenary is an impregnable fortress, built on a sheer cliff. Vlad took refuge there after his fall from power. Legend says that his first wife, rather than fall into the hands of the Turks besieging the castle, threw herself from the walls, screaming that she preferred to be eaten by the crows of the Argeș River than be their prisoner. A sacrifice that perhaps fed his dark fame even more. And speaking of his end, where did Vlad's body go? His tomb on Snagov Island, when it was opened in 1931, was found empty. Not only was his body gone, but inside, as historian Radu Florescu reports, they found only horse bones. His body has vanished. Stolen? Destroyed? Or, as some whisper, ascended into a different form, making the legend of his immortality terribly concrete? Dracula's influence has reached modern science. Psychiatry recognizes a rare and real mental illness called Renfield syndrome, or clinical vampirism. Affected patients have a compulsive and obsessive desire to drink blood, believing it gives them strength or supernatural powers. Could the myth have roots in a pathology of the mind? And here we come to a chilling connection. It is said that Adolf Hitler had a macabre admiration for Vlad the Impaler. He studied his tactics of psychological terror and, according to some historians, admired his ruthless effectiveness in subduing the enemy. Two historical figures linked by a dark thread of absolute cruelty. And his weaknesses? Why garlic? Why no reflection? Garlic was considered a powerful talisman against all evil spirits and diseases, not just vampires. As for mirrors, in antiquity it was believed they reflected not just the image but the soul. And an undead, a body without a soul, simply had nothing to reflect. It was not a question of silver but of spiritual essence. And for one last macabre curiosity, in the 1970s a Romanian scientist named Dr. Petre T. took blood from Vlad's presumed tomb at Snagov. What did he hope to find? Traces of a supernatural essence? The source of immortality? His notes remain mysterious, a scientific attempt to capture the very essence of the legend. But perhaps, in the end, the legend of Dracula has endured for centuries for a reason deeper than any historical fact. Because the vampire is not just a monster, it is the reflection of humanity's obsession with eternity. It is he who defies God, who refuses death and feeds on the life of others. And yet, behind that pale and cruel face, there is always a shadow of melancholy, a being condemned to live forever, but without ever being able to truly love. It is the supreme punishment for his sin of pride, immortality as an infinite prison. And it is precisely this dual nature of monster and tragic anti-hero that has allowed Dracula to never die, but to transform. These are the secrets, the broken threads, the chilling coincidences, the forgotten details. But all this leads us to one final, powerful question. A legend that, heard today with modern ears, reveals not only superstition but also human fragility in the face of death and the unknown. Is Dracula dead? Not at all. He has simply evolved. He has left his castle to walk within the concrete jungle. The vampire archetype, shaped by him, is more alive than ever. Today, his legend fuels an entire industry, dark tourism. Thousands of people travel to Romania to walk in the Count's shadow, in a strange blend of history, folklore, and marketing. They seek a thrill, an echo of that ancient terror. But why are we still so obsessed? Why don't we want him to die? If you think you've missed even a single detail of this incredible story, rewatch the video. It's a labyrinth of mysteries where each turn reveals something new. But before reaching the end of this journey, I want your opinion. Was Vlad Tepes a monster or a ruthless hero? And does Dracula's essence still wait in the dark? If this journey into the shadows fascinated you and you want to explore more historical mysteries, subscribe and activate the bell. Now, the final question is, because perhaps the true answer is not in history, but within us. Perhaps because in the end, the legend of Dracula does not speak only of blood, fear, or immortality. It speaks of us. The vampire is the mirror of the human soul, a being condemned to live forever, but without peace. It cannot see the sunlight because it is devoured by the shadow of its own desires. Dracula teaches us that the true monster is not outside, but within. It is the part of us that craves power, beauty, and control over time. Tease the voice that whispers, "I never want to die." And yet, the vampire's immortality is not a blessing, it's a curse. An eternity without love, without warmth, without light. Perhaps the message of the myth is this: life has value only because it ends. And so, every time a new vampire story is told, Dracula is reborn. Not as a monster to be feared, but as a symbol of our eternal conflict between light and darkness. Because deep down all of us wish to be immortal,